All right, on to this interview now. Almost 700,000 first-time students entering higher education and over 500,000 continuing with their studies have been approved for the National Student Financial Aid Scheme funding for the 2026 academic year, with over 18,000 applications rejected. This was announced by NSFAS during their media briefing in Tshwane yesterday. To talk more about this, we're very happy to be joined in studio by the Acting CEO for NSFAS, and he, of course, is Waseem Carrim. Pleasure to have you. I'm so glad you made it.
Good morning, Leanne. Yeah, sorry, lots of rain on the road.
It is. It's a nightmare out there. It truly is. But let's get straight into it. So, obviously, you know, we look and see where things are at the moment, and you gave us a briefing yesterday. Perhaps you want to give us just a quick summary in terms of what you announced.
Yeah. So I think, you know, NSFAS has been trying to brief the media every month and the public at large about where we are. It's an interesting time, but it's also a very anxious time for young people who are leaving the basic education system and going into higher education. And I think our strategy in January was really around giving students their funding outcomes before the release of the matric results. Once the matric results are released, you know, most universities issue their offer letters. So it's good for students to know whether NSFAS is funding them or not. I think February was really focused on us getting allowances and disbursements to students. You know, a lot of students are traveling far distances to come to campus. And for us, there's issues of hunger and accommodation and housing, and we wanted to make sure that students felt comfortable and safe here. Of course, what we do have is continuing students who have to meet a certain academic progression criteria to continue with their funding. If they don't meet that, they do have a right of appeal against NSFAS. And I think yesterday's briefing, where we've really been focused over the last month, is being able to process those appeals so that those students know where they stand. So I think really what NSFAS is trying to do is have a stable and a smooth start to the academic year, because we know higher education has been quite volatile over the last few years.
And how volatile NSFAS has been over the last couple of years. Let's not beat around the bush. Can you honestly say and sit here and say that you believe, I know you've been in this position, I think you've been for a year. It's a year now. Can you honestly say that you feel that the system is now working as it should?
Yeah, I think we're 80 to 90% where we should be. Accommodation is still a bit of a challenge for us, but I think there's infrastructure issues associated with accommodation. But other than that, I think we're much more stable than we were last year. There are structural issues, I think, in higher education, you know, issues of student debt and things like that need to be resolved. But I'd say NSFAS as a machine is functioning much more effectively and efficiently.
I mean, one of the biggest problems and where NSFAS faces criticism is that students really only discover their funding problems after arriving on campus. And that is a big problem, because everything is sorted on their side, and then they get there and the system fails them. Why? Why is it that the system seems to be rather reactive as opposed to predictable for students?
Yeah, so I think that's really one issue which we tried to fix this year. So if you look at our first media briefing on the 6th of January this year, we basically said to all students, first-time entering and continuing students, this is your status. You know, you're either funded or you're not funded, and now the appeals process opens up and you can interact with that there. We do have this issue of outstanding documents from students. So if you look at our beneficiaries who are from the South African Social Security Agency, it's much quicker because we rely on their database for funding. But students who are not SASSA beneficiaries, we have to confirm their household income. And to do that, we have to get their parental consent. And what we've noticed is a lot of students do struggle with giving us the appropriate consent forms. You know, we've tried to do a bit more, but I think a real takeaway for me this year is how we can support students better with providing us with those consent forms, because it's important from a compliance perspective, but we do find that students really struggle with it.
In terms of budgets, what are we talking about? How much has actually been set aside for the students for this financial year?
Yeah, so we have close to about 55 billion rand. About 45 billion rand of that sits in the university sector, and about 10 billion rand sits in the technical and vocational training sector.
Okay, are we talking about a lot of money here? And what one has to ask the question, is this enough for the increasing demand of students' financial needs, because it just gets more and more and more. There seems to be no places in, firstly, universities. We'll get to the accommodation shortly, but that demand is just growing exponentially.
Yeah, so I think the demand is influenced by a few things. So I think every year we see better basic education results, and that's a good thing, right? We want our kids to be doing better at school. But I think we know South Africa also has a cost of living crisis, which pushes more students into the NSFAS threshold here. Yeah. I think there's a couple of things that we need to look at. Of course, it was a political decision to shift NSFAS away from being mainly a loan-based fund into a bursary-based fund. And that was a good thing, I think. But I think the country and government as a whole needs to think about whether that policy is sustainable. The NSFAS model offers quite a suite of benefits. So it covers tuition, it covers accommodation or transport, and it covers allowances for students, right? And we probably need to review the suite of benefits about whether it should be as comprehensive. You know, does it need to be a mix of a bursary and a loan, perhaps? One of the things Cabinet asked us to do is to go and consult on what a long-term sustainable funding model for NSFAS is. I think what we'd like to say is that in our current moment, we have put in place some short-term reforms to balance out the budget. But where we're really focused is around ensuring that no academically or financially deserving student is left behind because of lack of access to funding. Yeah.
But the bottom line is that they are. Yeah. And this, I think, is a reality that you're admitting to as well, and have previously. You're saying that things are going to be better now. And the reason I say that is particularly when it comes to late payments. And one of the biggest complaints from both students, accommodation providers, universities, is the fact that they don't have the funds available, that they'll be staying somewhere, studying somewhere, but the bills haven't been paid because the NSFAS funds have not come through. This is a massive glitch in the system.
Yeah.
How is this going to be sorted? I mean, yesterday when we were doing broadcasting from beautiful accommodation, and yet, you know, they admitted that they do have to ask NSFAS students to leave because the money's not paid, and it's a business at the end of the day that unfortunately, even though they've been accepted by NSFAS, but the funds never arrive. And we're talking a year, perhaps 2 years down the line, the money still doesn't come.
Yeah. So I think if you look at this year again, you know, consistency of disbursements is something that's quite important to us. So both at the start of February and at the start of March, we were able to make significant upfront payments to universities, you know, to the tune of about 6.4 billion rand, which would enable them to have a smooth start to the year. And of course, it plays a role in their stability at campuses as well, because if they're able to disperse to students on time, this reduces the risks of protests and damage to infrastructure and those kind of elements there. Similarly, in the TVET sector, so in the university sector, we rely on universities to act as agents of NSFAS, so they disperse on our behalf. In the TVET sector, NSFAS had made 2 payments, one on the 13th of February and one on the 27th of February. They really achieved coverage, and those were timeframes communicated in December and adhered to by NSFAS, you know. So that's really one thing we're focused on is consistency of disbursements. Accommodation is a hot potato, as you know. And I think one of the challenges has been that accommodation would have been managed by the institutions themselves, not without its challenges here. In 2023, NSFAS took a decision to become more involved in the accommodation sector. You know, when we look at that decision, we do find that perhaps the right skills, capacity, because accommodation is different from student funding in the way that it's more of a property management function here. And perhaps the right skills and capabilities were not built here. What we have said to accommodation providers, and again, we've made this commitment, is that next week, Friday, the 13th of March, they will be reimbursed for all costs associated with February and March. During the course of last year, we did a significant mop-up of outstanding payments for 2024 and 2025. Close to 400 million was disbursed. We also did find challenges with accommodation providers. We did find that in some cases, accommodation providers would take students without confirming the NSFAS funding status, right? And then when the disbursement comes to us, we obviously have to check. We find that it's not an NSFAS student. So what we did this year is we tried to very much so communicate upfront what are the tick boxes that accommodation providers need to check to ensure that they are also able to be paid on time and efficiently.
Yeah. It just sounds, to be honest with you, that NSFAS has become too bureaucratic. It's too slow. The organisation simply seems too large and too complex to function effectively. That's what I'm feeling right now, because, I mean, you know, I'd look at a student getting accepted into accommodation because it's either that or they sleep on the streets. And this is the reality. Sleeping in streets, sleeping in libraries, sleeping in passageways of universities, being kicked out, and in the desperate need of trying to get an education. Why? Because your systems are too slow.
Yeah, so I mean, I'd slightly disagree with that. I'd say 2026 has been a much smoother process. You know, if I look at, we've got 76 institutions. We really had accommodation challenges at one institution, which was Cape Peninsula University of Technology. And even there, we were able to intervene and in the large majority be able to resolve the issue here. Yeah? I think NSFAS as a whole, you can't be making these kind of decisions in January, February when the academic year has already started, right? And I think a big part of what we've tried to do this year, much better than last year, is be able to communicate what these processes are in the prior year so that people know where they stand, students, accommodation providers. Yeah. What I think we also need to recognize is that NSFAS is not a South African social security agency. It's not just paying money on a monthly basis, right? We're dealing with a performance-based fund here, right? Students have to meet certain academic progression criteria for them to be able to graduate on time to become employed here, right? Accommodation providers need to maintain accommodation at a certain requisite standard to be conducive to the learning process, right? And I think in any government entity, finding the right balance between bureaucracy and efficiency is the appropriate balance that you need to be able to find, right? Delivering services to your constituency, but also complying with requisite laws and regulations. Is NSFAS going to be turned around overnight? It's not, right? But you build momentum to get you to the right place, and I'm confident that where we are building the right momentum to achieve that.
Well, we live in hope. It is only March, so we hope. We won't judge the 2026 year as well right now. We're judging from previous experience, which has been very frustrating.
Of course,
even to the point of, and I'm sure you sat there listening to the finance minister as well, basically saying that he questioned whether NSFAS should even exist.
Yeah.
And he is suggesting that the system, A, costs too much, it is not efficient, and he basically suggested rather, why can't government actually pay the universities directly, the accommodation directly, as opposed to going through NSFAS, because the job is not being done properly through NSFAS. What are your comments? How do you respond to the minister for that?
Yeah, so I think, you know, we will not bury our heads in the sand. You know, we engage regularly with National Treasury and we take their issues on board. And of course, you know, and I understand where National Treasury is coming from. NSFAS has been unstable for such a long period of time, right? But I don't think the answer is as simplistic as saying just hand over the function to the institutions, right? If you look at accommodation, for example, when institutions managed it, you had significant issues with students living in poor living conditions here, right? The Special Investigating Unit has found that institutions themselves, you know, had to return significant unspent funds to NSFAS, which were not appropriately declared here. Yeah? There is no mechanism for a central authority to accept applications, do means testing, do allocation, payments, and function effectively in that regard there, right? And there's also, I think, conflicts between universities being both the delivery service as well as the administrator of funds here, right? Of course, you know, whether NSFAS should exist or not is a political decision that will be taken, you know, by the government of the day, and will comply with that. As it exists today, NSFAS is established by legislation and law, and we have a mandate to deliver to society in terms of that legislation. And of course, we will be guided politically by our executive authority in what we. Where we are as a management team and as a board is focused on the delivery of students and the effective delivery. And I think a big focus of NSFAS has always been on access. Right? I think a big part of our strategy is moving us away from being an access-based fund towards being a performance, graduation and employment-based fund.
All right, we got to leave it there, but we really do thank you for popping in just to talk to us about some very pressing issues, and one that, of course, we have focused on all week here on Morning Live, and that is the issue of higher education here in South Africa, and NSFAS obviously being a major funder when it comes to students, their learning, accommodation, everything in between. And Waseem Carrim, the acting CEO of NSFAS, giving us assurances that the 2026 academic year already off to a much better start than previously, and talking to the outcomes of that 2026 higher education and training academic year. Thank you again for your time here on the program.